Grace woke at dawn and knew she couldn't stay in bed another minute. Monaco, August 1977. The palace was still asleep, even the servants hadn't started their morning routines. Grace slipped out of bed without waking Rainier, though they slept in separate rooms now, so there was no risk of that. She put on a simple black swimsuit, threw a robe over it, and walked barefoot through the silent corridors toward the palace pool. It was the only time she had any privacy, these early morning hours when the world hadn't woken up to watch her yet. By 7 the palace would be full of staff, and by 9 she'd have to be Princess Grace again, perfect and poised and public. But for now, in the grey light before sunrise, she could just be a woman who wanted to swim. The pool was outdoors, hidden behind high walls covered in bougainvillea, one of the few places in the palace that felt remotely private. Grace dropped her robe on a chair and dove in without testing the temperature. The shock of cold water was clarifying, almost painful, and she welcomed it. She'd been numb for so long that any feeling, even discomfort, was a relief. She swam laps with steady strokes, back and forth, her body remembering the rhythm even though it had been weeks since she'd last done this. Swimming was the only physical activity she still enjoyed, the only time her body felt like it belonged to her instead of being public property for cameras and critics to examine. She'd learned to swim as a child in Philadelphia, at the public pool where her father had trained. John Kelly had been an Olympic rower, and he'd insisted all his children learn to swim properly, not the leisurely dog paddle of the wealthy but real swimming, athletic and strong. Grace had loved it immediately, loved the way water held her, the way she could move through it with power and grace. In Hollywood she'd rarely had time to swim, always rushing between sets and publicity events. But here in Monaco, once she'd discovered the pool, it had become her sanctuary. The one place where she could be alone with her thoughts, where the performance could pause for 30 minutes. She was 47 years old and felt ancient. Her body still moved well in the water, but out of it she felt heavy, burdened by decades of being looked at, judged, found wanting or found perfect, which was somehow worse. People expected Princess Grace to be eternally young, eternally beautiful, the same woman who'd married Rainier 21 years ago. But Grace had aged. Lines around her eyes. Grey in her hair that had to be colored every 3 weeks. A softness in her arms and stomach that no amount of discipline could fully erase. She'd given birth to 3 children and lived through 2 decades of state dinners and stress, and her body showed it. But no one wanted to see Princess Grace age. They wanted the fairy tale frozen in amber, 1956 forever. She flipped onto her back and floated, staring up at the lightening sky. Stars were still visible, fading as dawn approached. Grace tried to remember the last time she'd looked at stars without thinking about what she had to do tomorrow, what dress she had to wear, what smile she had to produce. She couldn't remember. Everything was obligations now. Caroline was 20, already married and divorced, a scandal that the Monaco press had devoured gleefully. Albert was 19, preparing to take on more royal duties, distant and formal even with his own mother. Stéphanie was 12, still young enough to hug Grace without self-consciousness, but already showing signs of the rebellion that would come. Grace loved her children desperately, but she didn't know them, not really. How could she? She'd been too busy being Princess Grace to be fully present as their mother. The water lapped gently against her ears, blocking out all other sound. Grace closed her eyes and let herself drift. If she drowned right now, how long would it take anyone to find her? An hour? 2? Would they think it was an accident, or would they know, somehow, that she'd just stopped fighting? Not that she would. She had too much discipline for that. Too much training and endurance. You didn't survive Hollywood and 2 decades as royalty without learning how to keep going when you wanted to stop. But sometimes, floating in the pool at dawn, she let herself imagine just sinking down and not coming back up. Not suicide, exactly. Just surrender. Just finally being allowed to rest. She heard footsteps on the stone path and her body tensed automatically. The performance was about to start again. But when she opened her eyes and righted herself in the water, it was only Stéphanie, wearing her own swimsuit, looking uncertain. "Marmon, I saw you come out. Can I join you?" Grace felt a rush of love so intense it almost hurt. "Of course, mon petit cho. Come in." Stéphanie dove in with the unself-conscious grace of youth, all long limbs and easy confidence. She was going to be beautiful. Grace could already see it. And that terrified her. Because beauty was a trap, especially for women, especially for princesses. It gave you power and then took everything else away. They swam together in silence for a while, Stephanie doing elaborate underwater flips, Grace continuing her steady laps. Finally Stephanie surfaced next to her mother, treading water. "You come here every morning?" Grace nodded. "When I can. It's peaceful." Stephanie looked around at the high walls, the perfect landscaping, the ornate palace visible beyond the bougainvillea. "Don't you feel trapped? Even here?" Grace stopped swimming. It was such a direct question, too honest for the usual palace conversations where everything was coded and careful. "Yes," she said simply. "Even here." Stephanie paddled closer. "Do you regret it? Marrying Papa? Becoming a princess?" These were dangerous questions, the kind Grace had spent 21 years deflecting. But it was just the two of them, alone in the dawn light, and Grace was tired of lying. "I regret not knowing there was a third option. I thought it was either Hollywood or Monaco, career or marriage, independence or security. I didn't realize I could have said no to both and found something else entirely." Stephanie looked confused. "What would you have done instead?" Grace floated on her back again, considering. "I don't know. That's the tragedy. I didn't explore enough to know what else was possible." They were quiet for a moment. Then Stephanie said, "I don't want to be a princess. Not the way you have to be. I want to do something. Be someone." Grace's throat tightened. "Then do it. Don't let anyone tell you that wanting things makes you selfish or unfeminine or inappropriate. Don't trade yourself for approval." Stephanie swam a slow circle around her mother. "Is that what you did?" Grace wanted to say no. Wanted to defend her choices, explain that she'd done the best she could with the options available. But in the quiet of the pool, with only her youngest daughter to hear her, the truth came out. "Yes. That's exactly what I did. I spent my whole life trying to be what other people wanted. My father wanted me to be respectable, so I became an actress to spite him, then a princess to please him. Hollywood wanted me to be beautiful and untouchable, so I played that role perfectly. Monaco wanted me to be the fairy tale, so I gave them the fairy tale. But I never asked what I wanted. And now I'm 47 years old and I don't even know who I am underneath all the performances." Stephanie looked stricken. "But you're Princess Grace. Everyone knows who you are." Grace laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Everyone knows the image. The icon. The photograph. But the person inside. She disappeared years ago. If she ever existed at all." Stephanie swam closer and hugged her mother, getting them both wet and not caring. "You exist, Marmon. You're right here." Grace held her daughter and felt tears mix with the pool water on her face. "Part of me is here. But so much was lost. My career. My identity. The chance to figure out who Grace Kelly could have been if she hadn't run away to Monaco." They pulled apart and Stephanie treaded water, studying her mother's face. "Would you leave? If you could?" Grace considered the question honestly. Would she leave Rainier, leave Monaco, leave the title and the palace and the whole elaborate prison? 5 years ago she would have said no immediately. But now, floating in the pool at dawn with the whole day of obligations stretching ahead of her, she wasn't sure. "I don't know. I have responsibilities. You children. The charities. The role I've played for 20 years. She paused. "But sometimes I dream about getting in a car and just driving. Not to anywhere specific. Just away. Somewhere no one knows I'm Princess Grace. Somewhere I could be anonymous and messy and make mistakes without it being international news." Stephanie nodded slowly. "I understand that. I feel trapped too, and I haven't even done anything yet. I'm 12 and already people are watching me, judging everything I wear and say and do. Is this what the rest of my life is going to be? Performing for strangers who think they own me because of who my parents are?" Grace felt a fierce protectiveness surge through her. "No. You're going to make different choices than I did. You're going to be selfish when you need to be. You're going to disappoint people. You're going to do what you want instead of what's expected. And when people criticize you for it, you're going to remember that their opinions don't matter more than your life. Will you support me, even if I do scandalous things? Stephanie asked. Grace pulled her daughter close again. Especially if you do scandalous things. I'd rather you be scandalous and authentic than perfect and empty. They floated together, mother and daughter, both trapped in the same golden cage but at different stages of understanding it. Grace had spent 20 years being slowly erased. Stephanie was just beginning to feel the pressure. But maybe, Grace thought, maybe she could save her daughter from the same fate. Maybe watching Grace disappear would teach Stephanie to hold on tighter to herself. The sun was rising now, turning the sky pink and gold. The palace was waking up. Soon the servants would appear and the schedule would kick in and Grace would have to be Princess Grace again. But for these few minutes, she was just a mother swimming with her daughter, speaking truths that would never make it past the pool walls. Marmon. Stephanie said. Yes. Do you ever think about acting again? Even just for fun? Community theater or something? Grace smiled sadly. I think about it constantly. Every time I watch a film, I imagine myself in the roles. Every time I pass a theater, I wonder what it would feel like to be on stage again. But it's impossible. Princesses don't act. That was the deal. I gave up Grace Kelly to become Princess Grace. That's a terrible deal, Stephanie said bluntly. Grace laughed, surprised into honesty by her daughter's directness. Yes, it was. They climbed out of the pool and wrapped themselves in towels. The morning air was already warm, promising another hot August day. Grace looked at the palace, golden in the sunrise, beautiful and suffocating. 21 years she'd lived here. 21 years of playing a role she never auditioned for. And she'd probably live here another 20 years, maybe more, playing it until she died. The thought should have been comforting, this certainty, this security. Instead it felt like a life sentence. Stephanie was watching her. You look sad. Grace touched her daughter's face. I am sad. But I'm also grateful. For moments like this. For you. For getting to tell the truth for once instead of performing. They walked back toward the palace together, leaving wet footprints on the stone path. Will you come swimming with me again? Stephanie asked. Tomorrow. Grace nodded. Every morning you want to. This can be our time. Our truth-telling time. Stephanie grinned, looking younger than her 12 years. Good. I have a lot of questions. Grace braced herself. I'm afraid to hear them. Like, did you really date all those married men in Hollywood? Stephanie asked with mischievous innocence. Grace groaned. We're going to need a bigger pool. They parted ways in the corridor, Stephanie heading to her rooms to get ready for school, Grace toward her own suite to begin the transformation into Princess Grace. She showered off the chlorine and sat at her vanity in her robe, looking at her reflection. Her hair was wet and unstyled, her face bare of makeup. She looked tired. Human. Real. In an hour she'd be perfect again, hair coiffed and makeup flawless and expression serene. But for now, she let herself look like a woman who'd been swimming at dawn, who'd cried in the pool, who'd told her daughter the truth about regret and loss and the price of being perfect. Grace thought about what she'd said to Stephanie. About driving away, about being anonymous, about choosing differently. It was all fantasy, of course. She would never leave. She had duties, responsibilities, a role to play. Caroline's scandals needed managing. Albert needed guidance. Stephanie needed a mother who was present even if she couldn't be fully honest. And Monaco needed its princess, the beautiful American who'd chosen their tiny country and given it glamour and legitimacy. Grace was trapped, not by locked doors but by obligation and expectation and the simple fact that she'd played this role so long she didn't know how to stop. But maybe, she thought as she began applying her makeup with practiced precision, maybe telling Stephanie the truth was enough. Maybe preventing her daughter from making the same mistakes was the one truly good thing Grace could do with the wreckage of her own choices. She couldn't get her own life back. Grace Kelly was gone, buried under 20 years of Princess Grace. But Stephanie was still young, still unformed, still capable of choosing differently. And if Grace's only legacy was teaching her daughter to be selfish enough to save herself, that would have to be enough. The makeup was done. The hair was styled. The perfect dress was selected and put on. Grace looked at herself in the mirror and saw Princess Grace looking back, serene and elegant and utterly empty. But underneath, where no one could see, the woman who'd swum laps at dawn and cried in the pool was still there. Hidden. Buried. But not completely dead. Not yet. She had the pool. She had early mornings. She had conversations with Stéphanie where she could be honest. It wasn't much. It wasn't the career she'd sacrificed or the identity she'd lost. But it was something. A small rebellion. A tiny space where Grace Kelly still existed, even if only in whispers and stolen moments and the privacy of chlorinated water. Grace left her room and walked down the corridor toward breakfast, toward the day's schedule, toward being Princess Grace again. But her muscles ached pleasantly from the swimming, and her mind held the memory of Stéphanie's questions and her own honest answers. Tomorrow she'd wake at dawn and swim again. The day after that too. For as long as her body allowed it, she'd have this one thing that was hers. This one performance she gave for an audience of one, or sometimes two if Stéphanie joined her. The rest of the day belonged to Monaco. But the pool, in the grey light before sunrise, belonged to Grace. She passed a mirror in the hallway and caught her reflection. Perfect. Untouchable. Princess Grace in full armor. But if you looked very closely, if you knew where to look, you could see it in her eyes. The woman who'd floated on her back and wished she could disappear. The mother who'd told her daughter to be selfish. The actress who still imagined herself in roles she'd never play. The swimmer who understood that some prisons were just very beautiful pools with very high walls. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was keep swimming, even when you knew you'd never reach the other side. Even when the laps were endless and the water was cold and no one was watching except your youngest daughter and your own drowning reflection. Even when being Grace Kelly was impossible and being Princess Grace was killing you and the only thing left was the space between strokes, the brief moment of weightlessness before you had to surface again and breathe and keep going. Grace took a breath and headed to breakfast. The pool would be there tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow. Until it wasn't. Until she ran out of tomorrows and the swimming stopped and all that was left was the performance. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, she'd swum. She'd cried. She'd told the truth. And that, in the mathematics of a life lived in service to everyone else, would have to be enough.